I'm sorry Sarah and I can't be with you in person. Such is the problem of organizing an event like this with a bunch of old folks. I have quite an assignment. I have 15 minutes to summarize the history of the world since 1960. I'm used to talking for a class hour about little-known incidents in the life of Millard Fillmore, whose entire life, as you know, was a little-known incident. Let's go back to the 50s and our isolation in Hanover. Without co-education, without freeways connecting to Boston and to the women's colleges, and our weekend automobile accident reports, especially during that long, icy winter. They prefigured, perhaps, the weekend casualty reports on Vietnam on the major network news programs, including Bob Hager's Huntley and Brinkley report, which, of course, are fast disappearing before our eyes. More about the media later. Those new highways that connected us to the civilized world were authorized when we were freshmen, now a politically incorrect term, via Eisenhower's National Defense Highway Act, with the Cold War word defense tossed in to convince budget balancing Republicans that it related to national security. We would not have eagerly paid for the race to the moon, which began in 1961, had it not been embedded in Cold War politics. Similarly, the National Defense Education Act, passed when we were juniors, had a dramatic effect on university curricula for several decades, despite Ike's prescient warnings in 1960 about the influence of the military-industrial complex, even in academia. Speaking of that military-industrial complex, we had to worry about our military obligations then, until 1973 and the all-volunteer Army. Had there been a draft in 2002, I doubt we would have gone into Iraq. Before Ike's highways, we were far more insular and isolated than we are now, or even in the 70s. I remember a day in 1959 when Harry Tansey called us aside to show us what was to him a new bakery product that just arrived from Boston. He called it a bongle. As for bongles, or bagels, I didn't know it at the time, but Dartmouth, as well as most of the Ivy League schools, still maintained or just recently had given up Jewish quotas. In the 80s, Berkeley, among other California universities, instituted an informal quota system to limit the number of Asian students whose academic achievements had disproportionately eclipsed those of other groups in the state and whose physiques were generally too slight to maintain Division I athletic programs, despite Yao Ming. Parenthetically, when we were in school, the foreign-born population was around 5%. Today it is 12%. And a related factoid, which may have something to do with the future of race relations, in 1960, 2% of all marriages were interracial. Last year, they numbered 15%. Needless to say, aside from perhaps one handful of Native Americans, Asian Americans, and African American, our class of 800 was especially white. And despite the fact that we were in school during the takeoff of the modern civil rights movement, I remember few bull sessions about our own lack of diversity. Except for athletes and musicians, African Americans were absent from the mass media, and certainly from print and electronic commercials during our formative years well into the 60s. Like most of you, I doubt we thought then that we would one day see a day when an African American would become president, let alone one born in Kenya. We graduated in 1960 when the 60s allegedly were beginning, but in reality the 60s began in 1964 with the arrival of the Beatles, the escalation of the Vietnam War, and the increasing militancy of the civil rights, soon to morph into the Black Power movement, and the emerging gay, Latino, environmental, Native American, and modern women's movement. Betty Friedan's book, for example, was published in 1963. The 60s ended in 1974 with the winding down of the Vietnam War, the end of the Nixon presidency, and the onset of the decade-long stagflation that shifted college students' attention from protests and communes to finding a job. The 60s began as well with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two epical bits of legislation that many of us at the time thought had gone a long way towards resolving our racial crisis. Lyndon Johnson knew better when he signed the Voting Rights Act and noted sadly, "There goes the South." And it went to the Republicans as Nixon pursued a Southern strategy in '68 that continued on through the Reagan administration to the present. This made the Republican Party more conservative and the Democratic Party more liberal. Some like the idea of having two ideological parties, just as they do in Donald Rumsfeld's irrelevant Old World. but we have seen how it has made governing much more difficult compared to the days when someone like Johnson could negotiate with Republican leader Everett Dirksen, or even earlier, when Eisenhower cooperated with Senator Lyndon Johnson to continue the Democrats' containment and not the Republicans' rollback policy in the Cold War. Our most famous Dartmouth politico of the 20th century, aside from our own Bob Farmer, Nelson Rockefeller, would not recognize his old party today and certainly would not be welcome in it. Nor would Republican Justice John Paul Stevens, who President Ford selected for the Supreme Court. He claims he has not changed. It is the country that has changed. Speaking of that failed rollback, a Republican rhetorical policy in 1952, one byproduct was the bloody Hungarian Revolution of 1956. I remember interviewing for the Dartmouth several Hungarian refugees who came to Hanover that year after that failed revolution. It was events like those during those alleged happy days that led me to write a despairing essay for Great Issues in 1960 that was so pessimistic about the prospect for survival that the reader spent a good deal of space trying to make me feel less gloomy. Well, Russia and the United States made it through the Cold War without blowing each other up, although we came close during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and also during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Henry Kissinger and Al Haig ordered an alert while Nixon was upstairs in the White House sleeping off the Saturday Night Massacre. There are also several cases on both sides when system failures brought some of the missile monitors close to pushing a button, and we now know that the words and actions of the 1981-83 Ronald Reagan came close to convincing Moscow that we were preparing a first strike. Few among us when we graduated ever thought we would live to see the end of the Cold War, and especially the end of the Soviet Union. Indeed, if you examine journals and newspapers in 1988 and 1999, you will find few Kremlinologists predicting the events of 89-91. It was almost as astonishing to see apartheid fall in South Africa in 1994 as it must have been for many of you in the financial world to witness the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. On the other hand, who would have thought that the Arab-Israeli dispute would still be with us, with interstate wars in 1948, 56, 67, 69, 73, and internal wars and intifadas among Israelis, Palestinians, and Arabs from the 90s to the present day, despite the fact that virtually all outsiders can envisage the outlines of a reasonable compromise peace. In fact, a peace close to the one proposed by Bill Clinton at the tail end of his administration. Bill Clinton, who had been impeached by the House, joining a presidential hall of infamy that included Richard Nixon, who resigned in 1974 before the House and Senate had a chance to toss him out of office. And who would have thought that we would have relatively civil relations with communist China and communist Vietnam today and still have no relations with communist Cuba, 90 miles away, as we approach the 50th anniversary of this remarkable situation. When we entered Dartmouth in 1956, the UN had 80 members, with the colonial systems formally intact, although they were beginning to fall apart. Ghana's independence in 1957 was a major news event that year, as was Cuba's revolutionary break with the United States in 1959, which some of you may remember vividly from the Godfather film. There are now 192 members in the World Organization, which has fallen out of favor with Americans ever since we lost our majority and confronted scores of votes in the General Assembly against us and our allies. Thank goodness for the veto in the Security Council, which many Americans opposed when Franklin Roosevelt announced it in 1945, since we didn't need it then, although the Russians certainly did. We used our first veto in 1970. The vast majority of members of the UN today reflect the changing coloration of the international system, with the most dramatic change in our lifetimes, the rise of Red China. Now, of course, thanks to Richard Nixon, the People's Republic of China. In 1987, Yale historian Paul Kennedy published The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, suggesting that we were in decline, just like the Spanish, Dutch, French, and British of previous centuries, other empires that had overextended themselves. He made the cover of Time with his analysis, which was bitterly opposed by many citizens in the proud days of mourning in America. Professor Kennedy appears to have been a decade or so too early, with our country now in hock to Beijing, with most of our manufacturing done by Asians, and with our economic and political influence on the wane throughout the world, despite the uptick in our popularity and respect since the election of Barack Obama. Back again to Dartmouth in this stream of consciousness in the 50s, my then girlfriend, now my wife, went to the University of Wisconsin. I remember corralling a whole bunch of change to frequently call her from a communal payphone long distance, a concept that no longer exists. How much easier it would have been had we had cell phones, the internet, and webcams. Or what would have happened had we gone to college in the post-feminine mystique era? I know that many of the wives in the audience today ended up, after graduating with honors from Wellesley and Smith, teaching in our school systems as they supported us in law, medical, and graduate school. 10 years or so later, comparable women would be going to those same law, medical, and graduate schools. One unfortunate byproduct of that revolution was the decline in quality of teachers in our public school system, as the best and the brightest women, the A students, went on to more prestigious and better paying professions, leaving the noble profession of teaching to the B and C students. Another reason why women moved on was the pill, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year along with us. Note that aside from the invasive vasectomy, only recently have experimental birth controls been available for men. I know, life is unfair. Obviously, the technological revolution, the revolution in the way we all communicate today, was as consequential as the modern women's liberation movement. Many of us in the late 50s wrote our papers in longhand, which was not especially thrilling to our instructors, and those with typewriters stained their hands with whiteout, which was invented by Michael Nesmith's Michael Nesmith was one of the monkeys. We had no word processors, of course, which have changed for the better the way we all compose our documents with spell check and grammar check, although I fear that email and Twitters are continuing to destroy the English language if my students' papers are any guide. We may have lived during the last hurrah of print media, thanks in part to veteran print journalist Morton Kondracki and his McLaughlin Group and his Beltway Boys, along with other cable shows and the internet. Last year, 290 U.S. newspapers and 1,120 magazines folded, and the Washington Post is currently peddling Newsweek. And yet, according to last Monday's New York Times, we consume 3 times as much information daily as we did in 1960. And what about books in bookstores? I must admit I received a Kindle from our kids for Christmas a year ago, and we guiltily enjoyed downloading virtual books for under $10 and adjusting the print to old people's eyes, and also not adding more real books to our overloaded bookshelves. In those books and on the internet and on television, you can see and hear things that were outlawed when we were in school. When Lucy was pregnant, even the use of that word was verboten, and Rob and Laura Petrie had to sleep in Hollywood beds. The women we dated had curfews. We, of course, did not, and entry into their dormitories and houses was carefully controlled, compelling some of us to become panty raiders. The police were called out in our day because of those raids, even if the stealing of the undergarments did not involve bodily contact. Only a decade later, the police and the National Guard appeared frequently on campuses to deal with arson and other acts of violence as protesters attacked the alleged soft underbelly of American capitalism at Stanford and Columbia, and even at once obscure Kent State. We were also one of the last college classes to share music with our parents. Doris Day, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, as emerging rock and roll, or race music as it was called, was viewed by most of us in 1956 as a déclassé perversion. Now no one shares music with anyone else, connected as they are to their iPods and pads and phones, and not only are record albums gone, but tapes and CDs are on their way out as well. So we have come full circle. Given the headlines of the past month in the Middle East, in the Gulf, on the unemployment lines, in the deadlocked Congress, I fear my Great Issues essay today would reflect the same pessimism I felt in 1960, despite many of the positive changes over the past 50 years. Around the world, 50 years and 15 minutes, I can only imagine how fast someone will have to talk to cover that subject in 2060. I hope I have hit on some of the developments that have meaning for you, and that I have sparked some discussion during the question and answer period which will follow. Finally, anecdotally, I just wrote for a Detroit Weekly a restaurant review about a Chinese dive called Wahoo, which isn't really Chinese. I tossed into the review Dartmouth's old politically incorrect cheer, Wahoo Wah, which is how I will leave you today.